I want to really focus on agricultural extreme events, and that's something we haven't really worked on that much. We've been more looking at the general trends that might occur with climate change. But some of the kinds of things that we need to face are, what is the water that's going to be available? What are the extreme events? How does that affect especially perennial crops that might in their lifetime be subject to a lot of fluctuations in water? There's a picture there of oranges with ice, and from Sasha's talk we might guess that climate change isn't just going to warm the climate so that we have more citrus production, but there might indeed be still severe freezes. And then finally the idea of fire in rangelands and whether or not that we're going to be prepared to control some of those extreme events that result from that. So just a pitch for the importance of California agricultural production, the fact that we're important not just for California, but for the nation in terms of fresh fruits and nuts and vegetables. We have a huge investment in terms of agriculture in our economy. We're the only state in the US that produces a lot of these different commodities that are listed here. And something that we've been working on a lot is the fact that we really need climate change adaptation to keep our land use issues under control. If we have people who are really subject to extreme events in agriculture, there's more likely to be a chance of urbanization. And at present, agriculture in the state only contributes 6% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Urban is much larger in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per acre. And so one of the issues that comes up is, how do we put agricultural adaptation onto the AB 32 agenda as a way to essentially mitigate through ag land preservation. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. I had to make that pitch though. So what I'm going to start with is a survey that we did in a case study in Yolo County funded by the CEC peer program. And it has many components of adaptation to climate change. And the question that I'm going to bring up here is, are farmers concerned about extreme events and how to adapt? And so this was a survey sent out to 570 growers. Thanks to the Farm Bureau, we got a very high response rate, 35%. And people ranked these issues in terms of their concern. They were economic and regulatory concerns on the green dots, water concerns on the blue dots, and temperature concerns. And what you can see is that farmers in Yolo County are most concerned about more regulations from climate change and higher fuel and energy prices. And then markets. Are markets going to fluctuate? They were then concerned about water issues, availability, not so much increased flooding, and things that we'd call extreme events, sort of within the context of today's workshop. Heat waves, winter freezes, warmer summer temps, fewer winter chill hours were not very high on their agenda. So why is that? Why are these people who are so dependent on natural resources not more concerned about extreme events? Well, one thing is the farming community just in general is not that tuned in or involved in the climate change agenda. Another issue is that, and we have documented in this Yolo County study, that summer maximum temperatures, summer mean temperatures really haven't increased that much in irrigated lands in California. So maybe their own experience is not that this is really happening. And then the third issue is, in talking to farmers, they kind of feel like they're subject to extreme events all the time. And they're pretty good at coping with it. And so this is a quote off of a Farm Bureau publication in Ag Alert where they sort of profile different farmers every month. This is from just this fall, where this lemon grower talks about the fact that they've hit, within just a short time, heat waves, and then an inch and a half of rain, and the trees are freaking out. But it ends with a bright note that there's still enough moisture in the ground from the rain. So I think that's a pretty farmer relevant attitude, and we have to respect that. at the same time, researchers are really tuned into the fact that higher temperatures, CO2, drought are really going to change the playing field for crops. We know that higher CO2 will increase vegetative growth, but it's a lot harder to say whether it'll increase things like fruit and vegetable yield. Why? We can't do those experiments. You need really big plots of land to figure that out. We do know that many of our specialty crop commodities are really sensitive to heat waves and high temperatures and to summer rain. Tomato pollination's affected, lettuce turt burn can occur, fruits can experience cracking from early or late summer moisture. And so those are issues that we should be dealing with. Ozone toxicity may increase, big unknowns with crop pests and diseases. Cattle and dairy cows, there's some evidence that we might see decreased milk yield in the summer because of high temperatures, but we might see higher winter pasture because winters will be warmer. So these are all major unknowns, and I'm just going to talk about a few in more detail. Chill hours are always brought up in this context for grapes and fruit trees, so it's just a sort of a chill hour threshold for different crops. In which, without that cooling, flowering and fruiting either occurs abnormally or doesn't occur at all. And so there's many areas in California that are going to be affected by this. Throughout the state, chill hours are declining, but you can see from this map that the colored dots mean the extent to which chill hours are decreasing. It's a scattergram. There's not a pattern. So this is something that's very spatially determined. It's going to be a local adaptation issue. And so some of the crops that are affected are some of these crops that are really unique to California. This is a slide from Sasha that he gave me on the increasing humid heat impact on red wine grape yields. So you've already heard about the fact that these nighttime warm humid heat events are occurring. And so if you look at that blue line, and then you look at the black line, which is red grape crush gain compared to a baseline level, you can see that that 2006 heat wave was, the nighttime temperatures were correlated with a big decrease in red grape crush gain. So these are things that play out directly on agricultural production. This is a slide from Kamyar Gaveci at DWR, and DWR has done quite a bit of modeling looking at climate change variability and water demand. And so what you can see here is that this is the amount of water demand change that can occur with and without climate change. So climate change does really extend the range of possibilities of demand, either because of higher crop evapotranspiration or because of heat waves. So if you look at that kind of graph in more detail, looking at the baseline of total average historical demand, and then looking at some different scenarios for how California will be using water. With current trends, slow and strategic growth, and expansive growth all listed on this graph. And the point I want to make here is there's a really big difference in the effect of climate change on water demand depending on how the state's land use and water use patterns evolve. The same amount of water deficit in a drought year or extreme event that might a long-term drought could have very different impacts on agriculture depending on how the rest of the state is using water. So it's not just a matter of the weather event, but of the partitioning of water that we as a state decide to pursue. As part of that same study in Yolo County, We worked with the Stockholm Environmental Institute to run the WEEP model, which is a hydrologic model, and looked at some different ag adaptation scenarios this is over the course of the next century. And in the modeling that we heard about already, we will expect that some possible scenarios are a very warm, dry scenario. So we looked at 3 different adaptation scenarios. So this shows irrigation demand difference versus the current baseline trend, the dotted line, under a B1, which is a low emission scenario, and an A2 emission scenario. So the first scenario, adaptation scenario was that crop patterns were based on econometric models that followed our current choices and our current responses to climate. Not much difference. You can see the black line from current water use, water demand. The second adaptation scenario in red is adopting more diverse water efficient crops, things like safflower or olive. That decreases irrigation demand somewhat. But the biggest decrease in irrigation demand, and one that actually could take future demand to somewhat below current water use, was combining the diversification with water use efficient crops with technological changes like more drip irrigation, better runoff management. So it's that combination of diversification plus technology that could really help us out in these kind of drought years or in extreme events. This is modeling results from Richard Howitt's group, an ag economist at UC Davis, working with Jay Lund and using the SWAP and Calvin models. And this is statewide responses of agriculture to historical versus a warm, dry climate in 2050. And what this modeling showed was that due to the lack of water that we may see in such a scenario, there's going to likely be a decrease in ag acreage. There's going to be a decrease in water availability, and revenues will increase at a much slower rate. So according to this model, revenues will still increase, but at about 30% lower rate. Now, why will they increase given that kind of extreme situation? Well, the expectation is that people will continue to adopt technologies. They'll continue to find ways to reduce water demand, and they'll also continue to find markets for the new crops that come up. So it's not that we're going to see failure, we're just going to see revenues increase at a much slower rate, and that could affect people staying in business and a lot of sort of spin-off effects for the role of agriculture in California. So in that same modeling, what they were using in terms of a change in available water was about a 25% decrease in available water to agriculture. And I just want to point out the difference in percent yield change that they calculated. They used some baseline sort of models for different crops and their response to water between Sacramento and San Joaquin County. And here I want to bring up the same issue, is that there might be the same extreme event, but it could have a lot to do with resources in different parts of the state, which means that a lot of adaptation is local. So in Sacramento, we have pretty strong resources in terms of groundwater. We have a lot of water availability that may not be present south of the Delta in the San Joaquin County. And so we see more of an impact of that water availability, say on citrus, which actually is expected to increase somewhat under climate change, and in rice in the San Joaquin area than in Sacramento, which has inherently lower abilities to store water. This is work that was done by David Lobel and Chris Field at Stanford. And what they looked at is, sort of in retrospect, at ag disasters. This isn't modeling, it's what has happened in the past. From 1993 to 2007. And they have here a data set that's from NOAA, which is estimating the approximate damages that occur from the 10 most severe events in terms of damages during this period. And so the number one event was a freeze in December 1998, where they saw big changes, big decreases in oranges, lemons, olives, and cotton. You can see that as the green bar, green indicating cold. The heat wave in July 2006 that I just mentioned was particularly devastating for livestock. And the next three most damaging episodes were due to heavy rainfall in the spring and winter months. So it's a variety of different kinds of extreme events, and some of them would be expected based on what we've heard already about modeling to become more severe in the future. They also looked at indemnity payments through the USDA risk management program, and this was looking at, during this period, what were the indemnities paid for? And the number one most costly disaster was excess moisture, flooding. The next was cold spells, and the next was heat waves. And you can see that the payments from heat waves sort of gradually increase through time. Whether that's statistically significant or not, I don't know, but it is an interesting trend. Something that we've tried to do in a project that's the Vulnerability and Adaptation study that CEC and peers help support is get an idea spatially of what might be what we're calling an agricultural vulnerability index. Why do we want to do this? Well, in talking with people and thinking about the problem, this extreme event issue is something that's going to require a lot of local attention. How do we alert people that this is something that's going to happen? This agricultural vulnerability index we tried to design is something, it's just a prototype. But what we've used in this particular sub-index on climate variability is data from the Scripps modeling, GFDL, in the past historical period, and just looked at in this 12-kilometer grid, where would be locations that would be more subject to climate variability. You can see that from this overall map, this area around Bakersfield is most vulnerable. In fact, there's not all that much agriculture even occurring there, but the southern San Joaquin Valley and the desert areas are particularly vulnerable. I'm not going to get into this detail at all, but I just want to point out how we did this with using these different climate variables for each grid cell with the GFDL model, and then trying to look at which variables and principal component analysis most contributed to the pattern around the state. So changes in potential ET were particularly important, and so was the coefficient of variation in precipitation. And so, as I said, we calculated these for each grid cell and then looked at the variation around that. So it's just a start on this kind of thing. We've also have some other components of this index. But the main idea is, how do we get the word out that some areas might be more vulnerable to certain things than others? So what is needed? In speaking with people around the state, here's some ideas, not listed in any order. One is we need to build better modern monitoring systems for ag. We don't have that great of records on climate-induced extreme events and the agricultural repercussions. We need to emphasize renewable resources and inputs in our planning. I'm, for example, through cooperative extension. Why? Because in talking to farmers, a lot of what they're concerned about are things like fluctuating oil and energy prices. And if we can become more self-reliant, we may be, in addition to extreme weather events, less vulnerable to other kinds of extreme events. There's a need to plan for future ongoing changes for diversification. I'll explain a little bit more about the diversification thing in a minute. If we diversify, we need to have more flexible markets. We have a pretty rigid marketing strategy for many of our commodities in California right now. We need to avoid infrastructure breakdown. I haven't talked about it, but things like delta levee failures are things that can really affect agriculture. And then in terms of ag research for climate change, that's not really going on yet much in the state. And the kinds of things that we need to do or think more about heavy-duty drought preparedness, crop breeding and IPM, integrated pest management for diseases and pests we might not even have here yet, technological improvements, diversification strategies, and long-term sustainability. And, you know, when I say diversification strategies, it's not necessarily just like this picture of an organic farm here. It's trying to be very, to really think ahead in specific regions about what combination of crops might be really valuable in order to have markets and distribution schemes set up ready to get those things on the market. We have to deal with farm worker issues and things about heat waves effects on people working in the fields. And part of this strategy is really one, as I mentioned before, where we need to ensure the long-term viability of livelihoods of farmers if we want to avoid land use change towards urbanization. So a bit more detail. This is a slide from CDFA. What they're very concerned about is that there are a lot more new pests arriving in the state right now, whether it's because of climate change or globalization, we don't know. But trying to get people on board so that they're reporting things when they find them. I mean, think about it. If you're a farmer, do you want to be the one who reports this thing when it could be your stuff that gets quarantined or your county that gets quarantined? I mean, it's kind of a risk. This is something else that I wanted to put forth on this idea of adapting. And now this is from Richard Howe's work, so it is really focused on water. But what they did was they assumed a rate of technology change year by year from now until 2050. With the idea being is that people will continually find new breeding, more water management schemes, other kinds of alternative fertilizers and stuff that will keep increasing the change in technology that will support higher yields. At the same time, we're going to see that demands for different crops will increase. What will increase? According to their model, that what we'll see is a decrease in directly consumed grains. People are going for what Richard calls a more salad bar mentality. We're going to see more truck crops, which means sort of vegetables, strawberries, melons. We'll see more field grains that support animals. So this diet that becomes more animal protein-based, more salad bar, and less direct grain consumption was something that they used in foreseeing this projection for the future. So in a way, this can be seen as some market-driven reasons for diversification. And that's what we could be playing into as we start thinking about this diversification in terms of extreme events, too. This is another slide from the Yolo County project where we used soil data from the USDA Surgo maps to divide the county into different regions. And this particular region, what we called Region 2, was the one with the highest quality soils and has very reliable water deliveries at present, high groundwater storage. You can see that the soil quality based on those USDA rankings was from good to excellent, more or less. And what we found in overlaying that on a crop distribution map is that 50% of the land area was in tomato and wheat. Walnuts and almonds had 12% of the land area, but 25 other crops occupied 16% of the land area. And the message here is there's many other crops that can be grown here successfully, but the current marketing strategy is for processing in tomatoes and wheat. And that is what really drives incomes in farmers now. So there is potential to think about diversification. Now, why does that play right into extreme events? If you think of the physiology of different kinds of crops and the fact that a lot of extreme events in terms of heat waves or freezes occur over only a week-long span, the more diversified we are, the less there is a probability that an entire crop is sort of hammered by given extreme events. So what I want to try and emphasize to you is that from the different research that's been going on in these CEC peer projects, we can make a case for diversification both in terms of the physiology of the crops and the propensity for resilience there, but also in terms of income, diets, and so forth. So in conclusion, I want to say that farmers' perceptions of climate change and extreme events, at least based on our survey and talking to a lot of farmers, are not particularly strong right now, and we have to respect that. These are people who've been on the land for a long time. They have reasons for it, but we have to find ways to address that so that their input is really the force behind making some of these changes that keeps ag viable in the state. It could be that it's partly because there's such high spatial variability in terms of heat waves and other extreme events. It could be because there's so much uncertainty of pests and diseases, but we need to lock into that better to understand why isn't there that awareness of vulnerability. This next point is probably our biggest concern is long-term drought, and that economic growth from ag could really slow down in that. We need to find combinations of high cash value crops that are water use efficient and combine that with technologies, and that also fit into markets. So that is a strategy that involves really a lot of different sectors in the state. Diversification as a resilience strategy is something I've emphasized. We can think of it as sort of insurance value. The problem is insurance value down the road is costly now. And who has the input to put into something that's not very efficient, either economically or resource-wise? We need new crops and livestock. Everybody always says that, but where do we start and when do we start? On-farm renewable inputs are another form of diversification, like we could think of cover crops, different kinds of recycling of nutrients. And the bonus there is they can add to greenhouse gas mitigation. In that case, it'd be great if through CARB and AB 32, farmers could get some credits for greenhouse gas mitigation, which at present I don't believe is happening. And that we could be looking ahead to different kinds of food systems, maybe more local food systems that would help with this issue with diversification into new markets. So institutional support is needed in the California Ag Vision project that was sort of launched by CDFA in the last year or so. One of their strategies is to make sure that all different sectors within agriculture can adapt to climate change. And the long-term goal really would be that if we focus on ag sustainability, we can avoid land use change, mainly towards urbanization and the loss of livelihoods. So I just want to make a pitch for this study that's been going on for almost 4 years now through the CEC Peer Program, where we've used Yolo County as a case study for responses of agriculture to climate change. And it involves several different kinds of models, an econometric model to look at past and future effects of climate on acreage in ag, the hydrologic model I spoke about, an inventory of countywide greenhouse gas emissions, a survey of farmer views on climate change, and a model of local urban growth scenarios on what we can do to enhance infill growth and reduce the loss of ag land into urban. It's been really involved with many players in the county, farmers, planning department, flood control district, And it's been a real enterprise that I think could be useful for the rest of the state. And finally, I want to make these acknowledgments to people who've helped fund this work, and to members of my lab group that are really much more into field work and agroecology, but have been swept up into this, this big issue of climate change. Thank you.